Hello there, my dear ones, and welcome to a first in a special series of videos where I outline exactly what happened in the process of me being dismissed from the Free Church of England. You may wonder, why make this video now? Why have I held my silence for so long? Well, as you know, the appeals process of my dismissal is still ongoing. But in consultation with my legal team and with a lot of prayer and consternation, I've come to the conclusion that I have absolutely no confidence at all in the appeals process. I think the outcome is predetermined, and either way, I don't think revealing the truth of what's happened to me is going to make a difference in this appeal anyway. After all, I'm only telling my side of the story, and one has to wonder why there has been a cone of silence put on this. What are people afraid of for the truth coming out? So rather than go and talk to someone else about this first, I thought the best thing to do, instead of interviews or anything like that, was simply to film my perspective and to put it out there for the world to be the judge of. The appeals process is a tricky one because there has been no explanation whatsoever of how it is to proceed. It's been going on for 3 weeks. For a large portion of that, the Bishop Paul Hunt, who is overseeing it from the Southern Diocese of the Free Church of England, has been away on holidays. So it seems to me they're not actually taking it very seriously at all. So there's no need for me and my family to sit around with our life on hiatus, twiddling our thumbs, waiting for something that may or may not eventuate and may or may not be in our favour. Instead, the best thing we can do is to simply come out with the truth. So by way of introduction, I'd like to talk to you about a little bit of what happened. How did I get to this point? And that's what this first video is about. I was, in fact, dismissed from the Free Church of England without due process. And we will get into the nitty-gritty of all of that later on. But to begin, I want to make that clear from the outset. And I want to caveat everything I'm saying here by pointing out that I still have very many good and godly friends in the Free Church of England. I actually take no pleasure in making this video. I wish I didn't have to, because I believed in the dream of an independent Anglican church that was evangelical and filled with the Holy Spirit, staying true to the faith once delivered to the saints, as it says on the tin, holding fast to the faithful word. And doctrinally, I want to be very clear, the Free Church of England does that on paper. But in practice, it does not. And it has very many flaws. Now, I'm not a perfectionist. I'm not expecting a perfect church. But I am expecting that Christians should behave in a Christian way to each other. In the very least, we should attempt to, and should have some effort to reconcile our differences and to seek godliness. So, when I was first served with my letter of dismissal, it became very evident that the process was highly flawed. In fact, my legal team have pointed that out, that the process was incredibly out of whack. But we were told, and I found this out later on, that the secular ACAS, now for those outside the UK, that is workplace employment law, those guidelines were going to be used to process my disciplinary rather than the canons of the Free Church of England. And I want to be very, very clear here. The canons in the FCE have an explicit and well-established process for dealing with disciplinary measures against clergymen. Basically, it boils down to calling an ecclesiastical court of your peers, of both clergy and laity from around your diocese, to hear your case and make a determination. Following that, there is actually a clearly outlined appeals process. Every step of the way is mapped out with great detail and clarity in the canons. And it was actually during my disciplinary meeting that I was told point blank, and we have this recorded on tape for proof and evidence, that the canons of the FCE were intentionally ignored. And the reason was that it might compromise too many people. So that speaks volumes, I think, about the reasons why the internal processes of the church were actually intentionally avoided. The man who oversaw all of this, and I believe this was under the guise of John Fenwick, the bishop, pulling the strings, but the man who oversaw the practicality of the disciplinary process was the Reverend Dr. Robert Stephen. known by most in the FCE as Dr. Bob. He is the General Secretary of the FCE, although it's very important to note here, and we will explore this later, he is not a member of the Free Church of England. He is not one of my peers under the disciplinary canon who could or should review my case. He is an employee of the FCE. His job, technically, under the canons and the Constitution, is merely to sign checks and take minutes, not to act in any capacity of disciplining clergy or overseeing these things. That is acting outside the scope of his responsibilities and outside the clearly defined processes in the canons. Dr. Stephen said that we were going to use the ACAS rules for the aforementioned reason. The problem is they weren't actually followed. ACAS is very, very clear. Firstly, they say your employer should see whether the problem can be resolved in an informal way. The employer should attempt solving the issue with their employee in the first instance by privately talking about the issue with them. Well, that never happened. Listening to their point of view. That also failed to happen. And agreeing on what improvements can be made. That didn't happen either. I was issued with a disciplinary letter out of the blue, and the intention, I believe, was simply to get rid of me and to have some sort of a vague semblance of a process that they could say they followed so that they felt they were ticking boxes. And to the outside world, it would look like it was all bona fide and above board. The ACAS Code of Practice on Disciplinary and Grievance Procedures is the minimum, the absolute minimum that workplace law in the United Kingdom says we should follow. But their website tells us you may have your own code or policy with some differences that better suit your organization. In other words, for instance, in a large corporation, you might have a HR department with their own procedures in place that can be enacted before one reaches the formal disciplinary process. That might be, say, a 3-step warning program, which many companies have. So in a religious context, in a Christian context, in the Free Church of England, that, I think, would mean the canons should have been followed first. And failing that, or if they found the person guilty, then the secular ACAS workplace rules could have been deployed for disciplinary or dismissal of an employee. The jumping straight to the ACAS, even though they botched it, the so-called ACAS disciplinary, shows a motive and an intent, in my personal opinion. Right. I think that we need to be very, very clear here that we are well aware that somebody was desperate to be rid of me. And we're going to unpack some of the reasons why that might have happened. If you take the time to look up Bishop John Fenwick on YouTube, what you will find is actually on the track record, in the public domain, a lot of alleged controversies, particularly pertaining to talented clergy who were removed or forced out of the Free Church of England. I don't think they quite knew what they were getting into when they decided to do this to me. And it turns out I am the latest, and hopefully the last, Lord willing, in a long line of godly clergymen whom this or similar things have happened to at the hands of the Free Church of England hierarchy. You may wonder, why did I join the Free Church of England if I knew this? Well, the fact is I didn't, and perhaps there's a lesson for me there. Maybe I was too naive and too trusting, and I should have done my research to figure out the truth. I was warned by one or two godly men, which I dismissed as being merely a grievance between two people. I should have taken the time to search on the internet and picked up on the pattern. But in saying that, I believe the Lord works all things together for the good of those who love him. And I actually do not regret entering the Free Church of England. I had to leave the C of E because of its apostasy, and I'm thankful for the home which I had for 13 months among the ranks of the Free Church of England's clergy. I've made many lifelong friends in that denomination, and my prayers go out to all of them as they struggle and suffer through corruption and a lack of transparency and honesty from the hierarchy. God has worked this for good. if I hadn't stepped out in faith, leaving the Church of England and entering the Free Church of England, I would never have been led by the Lord to Morecambe. I would never have planted our beautiful church. I would never have met our amazing church family. And this is by far the best church I have ever pastored in my life. And if I were not the pastor here, I would still want to attend because I love these people very dearly. They are an exceptionally faithful and godly group of Christians. I think that the FCE may well have bitten off more than it could chew in this case, because in the past, when they have allegedly acted in similar ways towards other churches and clergymen, there has not been a huge social media presence. I have, for whatever reason, by God's grace and twist of the Lord's providence, ended up as a minor Anglican celebrity through no desire of my own. And so I don't think they really thought through the implications of what they were doing by sacking me in the same way that they had in the past with others. The pattern repeated itself almost as though Bishop John couldn't help himself. And so it's become a global story. Its ramifications have rippled around the Anglican world, particularly in the GAFCON and continuing circles. In the past, mostly elderly folks were bullied, allegedly, harassed, allegedly, and given strife or pushed out of their churches. These claims are there for all to see on news articles from the last 20 years or so, particularly with a fair amount of intensity in the last 5 years. Me and my congregation are fairly young, and we're fairly vocal. We're quite outspoken about the injustice and the outright wickedness that we see at play here. We won't be bullied. We won't be pushed around. We will make sure that the truth is out there. And as one of my dear church counsellors, Julie, loves to say, one of her favourite phrases is, tell the truth and shame the devil. So I suppose that's precisely what I'm aiming to do in this video and the subsequent ones that will follow it. To simply speak the truth without anger or malice or vengeance or resentment in my heart. I have prayerfully emptied myself of such things in the hope that the FCE might actually come to its senses and be saved. That actually people might be warned off joining it if it does not change. For I feel a great sense of guilt that I have attracted so many into this denomination, only to discover myself that at its core and at the top, there is incredible darkness. Beloved, I feel in my heart that this video series is going to be part of shining a light on a great darkness. And I hope and I pray that for my little effort in doing this, the gospel of Christ is preserved and proclaimed in England. That somehow, in some way that I can't fathom, the Lord might use this truth-telling to bring forth the fruits of revival and renewal in his kingdom. Sometimes those things can only come through initial pain and hardship as the Lord purifies, refines, and transforms his bride, ready to meet him on the day of judgment. Beloved, it is uncanny that so many before me have suffered the same alleged bullying, harassment, discrimination, and even racism at the hands of the FCE hierarchy. As we continue in these videos, I hope and pray that the Holy Spirit may lead us into all truth and that the light might shine on the darkness. After I was ordained in the Anglican Church of Australia, I served my curacy in the Diocese of Melbourne. And then as a young minister looking forward to entering his first parish, the most unusual thing happened. My wife and I received the call of God to uproot our entire life and our little young family and move over to the other side of the world, to the United Kingdom, on a mission from God to revive dying parishes in the United Kingdom. Now, that might sound like a pretty crazy thing to do, but when the Lord calls you to something, you have to obey. And we stepped out in faith, and he provided through incredible miracles and acts of providence. I mean, it's a whole other story I could tell another time. We ended up in the UK in 2019, and by God's grace, we were able to take on 3 struggling parishes way north in Cumbria, and we were there for 3 years. That was a wonderful time of experiencing all the joys of British culture and getting used to living in Britain, but it was also 3 lovely parishes that we were pastoring on a short-term mission contract. Then we moved to the Diocese of Leicester, where we took on a single parish that was similarly struggling and seeking renewal and revival. And it was only after Living and Love and Faith came in, and it was passed at the Church of England's General Synod, that I became well aware that I could not remain in an apostate organisation. We had to get out as quickly as we could to escape the wrath of God falling down upon the heterodoxy and the false teaching that had become completely rampant in the C of E. And I could not myself belong to an organisation that was going to bless sin. So we stepped out towards the GAFCON churches. Now, I had been a member of GAFCON since seminary back in Australia, and we examined both branches of GAFCON here in the United Kingdom. They are AMIE, or the Anglican Mission in England, and the Free Church of England. We ended up going FCE, the Free Church of England for short, because it was more liturgical. They used the Book of Common Prayer in most of their worship services. And importantly for me, with a young family, thinking of mouths to feed, they could offer me a stipend or a salary and a home to live in, a vicarage. We are immensely thankful, I think this is important to say, for that opportunity. And without it, I don't reckon we could have taken that leap of faith to escape the C of E. And that's why I make no judgment on brothers who are faithfully Orthodox but remain in the C of E for now, because it is an immensely stressful and frankly frightening thing to do. The safety and security net of a secure salary and a home to live in is something that I think a lot of English clergymen really, really rely on, especially if they have families. Even from the beginning, though, in our time with the Free Church of England, there were issues with transparency and with honesty. We had stepped out in faith. I had quit my job in the Church of England and found a home in the FCE. I was welcomed with open arms. But alarmingly, the promise of the stipend for a set period of time was suddenly revoked. And we were left in limbo. And we had to, all of a sudden, without anyone in our church, figure out how we were to self-fund. But God's grace is amazing and his provision is supernatural. The Lord built an incredibly faithful and godly congregation around us. We launched our community store, which is a kind of charity shop or thrift store for Americans who where we attempt to do outreach and evangelism, but also to bless the community, and it makes a small income for the church as well. And through the generous giving of my growing YouTube subscriber base, I found an online community who were able to donate, and therefore from those 3 streams came enough just every month to cover my salary, my stipend in churchy terms. This incredible act of God's grace is really what rescued us and saw the beginning of the revival in Morecambe. They were able to have a full-time minister, and we saw more and more and more people attracted into the little tumble-down church as we began to clear it and clean it and restore it. The first months of my time in the FCE were fairly positive. I had a pretty good relationship with Bishop Fenwick and Dr. Bob Stephen. It was fairly positive and collaborative, and we saw radical growth and transformation in the Emmanuel congregation. So you might be wondering, well then, what changed? Well, the simple answer, I think, after a lot of reflection and discussion with our church community, is that our congregation was simply too godly and too successful. What do I mean by that? Well, since being fired, I have been informed by previous Emmanuel members, so those folks who used to attend under the previous minister before he died, that there was alleged attempts by Bishop Fenwick to sell part or all of the Emmanuel property in the last 5 years or so, particularly during the COVID lockdown. And I even met a local business owner who had claimed that he had been attempting to purchase the building, but that was blocked by one of the trustees. I also have a signed affidavit, a witness statement from a GAFCON priest who just 2 days after I had been fired called Bishop Fenwick inquiring about my well-being and the well-being of the Emmanuel congregation. And he was told point blank by Bishop Fenwick, or so he says in his witness statement, that in fact his intention was to sell Emmanuel Church. Our congregation grew far more rapidly and expanded in both depth of faith and numbers more than anyone could have ever imagined. God has sent us a ragtag collection of the most godly, righteous, faithful, mature Christians I have ever had the privilege of pastoring. All have escaped apostasy and have left other churches which have compromised on God's word. So they are like bloodhounds. They can sniff out heresy and error at 100 paces. And they particularly, many of them, have an eye for spotting bullying, harassment, and falsehood. For this reason, I believe myself and the Emmanuel congregation fell into the crosshairs of Bishop Fenwick. As I mentioned in the introduction, there is allegedly, and this is on the public record if you take the time to Google him, lots and lots of question marks around the leadership and character of this man. I do not think that Bishop Fenwick can handle anyone who questions his authority, or people who ask for transparency and honesty, and he becomes immediately hostile to people who want to hold him to account. From very early on in my time with the Free Church of England, I experienced uncomfortable and unwanted criticisms about my hobbies, my family life, and even my ethnicity as an Aussie. And from what I can tell from other folks who have been forced out or who quit the FCE, there was a definite pattern here of people who unfortunately endured similar hardships. The first major turning point which soured my relationship and Emmanuel's relationship with Bishop Fenwick came after we had some issues with our student minister. We had to have a vote to see if he would continue his ministry with us after attempts at intervention following Matthew 18's principles of resolving issues between brothers and sisters in Christ. And the church council and the wardens and I unanimously suspended him on the basis that he had abandoned Anglican and more specifically Free Church of England theology and practices in favour of heading towards Eastern Orthodoxy. And this is something we see actually a lot of young, dissatisfied Protestant men doing in our day and age, because they are attracted to what they see as the unchanging, eternal nature of Orthodoxy. Of course, I don't actually hold to that, but that's what they see. They see the Eastern Orthodox Church as they proclaim themselves to be as the one true, pure, undefiled, unchanged church. This, of course, drew him in, and if you're holding to Eastern Orthodox theology, unfortunately, you're holding to theology that is quite contrary to Protestantism. That's not to say that our brothers and sisters in the East are not Christian, and I'm not getting into a theological debate here, but I would say whatever tradition of Christianity you are serving in, or seeking ordination in, or you are ordained in, you should adhere to its doctrines and its practices. And if you start to drift off to some other theological camp, then for the sake of integrity, but also for the pastoral well-being of the people around you, especially the flock and congregation that you are attempting to lead, you should have the integrity to move on. Bishop Fenwick took offence to our suspending of our student minister over these issues, and I think this is because, as is evidenced by his writing in his textbook, An Anglican Ecclesiology of the Gospels, and also in the modern language experimental liturgy of the Northern Diocese, which by and by has never been approved by Convocation as far as I can tell, Bishop Fenwick has removed the Filioque clause from the Nicene Creed. Now, for those who aren't familiar with theology, that simply means he has favoured an exclusively Eastern Orthodox version of the Nicene Creed, whereas in the West we would say that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. In the East they say that the Spirit of God only proceeds from the Father. And Bishop Fenwick has made a point of having the Eastern version included in his modern language contemporary liturgy. He also went to great lengths to include Syrian Orthodox and Eastern Orthodox bishops in his consecration service when he was made a bishop in the Free Church of England, rather than having only Anglican or continuing Anglican or GAFCON bishops. So, although he was ordained a little before GAFCON formally coalesced into a global coalition of Anglicans, the point is that he made a significant focus of having Eastern Orthodoxy included in his ordination because of his particular theological understanding, which you can read in his book, of apostolic succession. Now, that is potentially a very problematic issue because if we have a student minister who's gone off to Eastern Orthodoxy and we are reporting this to our bishop, hoping that, of course, you would expect your bishop in your denomination would hold to your denominational doctrinal standards, and then suddenly he doesn't, you've got a whole crisis unfolding before you. And that's exactly what Emmanuel faced. You can even see photographic evidence that Bishop Fenwick doesn't have a problem with breaching the Free Church of England's clearly defined rules about, for example, decorations and the use of icons in a photograph where he licensed a lay reader. And I want to be very clear, the lay reader is not implicated in this at all, but it was in an associate church which is seeking to join the FCE. I was there in the room, and there was almost more icons on the walls than there was paint. Now, you might come from a tradition, Eastern Orthodoxy or Catholicism, where the use of icons or statuary in worship is completely acceptable. And that's fine. I have a very wide viewership. But you're not pretending to be an Anglican, and especially you're not pretending to be a very niche branch of Anglicanism, such as the Free Church of England is. If you look at the founding documents of the FCE, the use of such decorations in worship is utterly banned. So it's quite the controversy that our Bishop Primus, the leader of the entire denomination, would be so flagrantly ignoring those rules. But that explains his reaction when we suspended our student minister. And it's important to note that it wasn't only over theological changes. After the suspension of our student minister, we received absolutely no pastoral care from John whatsoever. And that's me personally and our congregation. And we had a number of people reaching out to John who were very, very pastorally hurt and were needing their bishop's leadership, guidance, and love. Now, John makes quite the song and dance in his books and in his small booklet, A Brief Introduction to the Free Church of England, which is produced by the Northern Diocese, which basically means John wrote it, about striving to have a episcopacy similar to Polycarp and St. Irenaeus, where he says he wants to be seen as a father to the church, this fatherly figure with a college of presbyters around him and a team of deacons who pastors the flock, who shepherds the shepherds. And people looked up to him for that. They sought him for that in this moment of crisis at Emmanuel Church, where even as a young congregation drawn in from all different traditions, we, after a lot of effort from myself and others, had started to gain a strong FCE Anglican identity. We had the Declaration of Principles as a massive poster up on the walls. We were doing studies on the 39 Articles of Religion. We had revived use of the Book of Common Prayer, which had been basically abandoned. And by the grace of God, we were doing what we said on the tin. We're an FCE Anglican church. And what we found was, when we turned to our bishop for support for having not only one of our flock, but somebody who aspired to leadership, not only just with us, but in the wider denomination, abandon those doctrines and principles, we didn't just find that we were left out in the cold, we found that there was hostility. And that came in the form of a determination that John made after an investigation into the events surrounding the student minister departing. Now, John took it upon himself outside of the canons. I can't find anything in the canons or the constitution of the FCE or anything in the bylaws which says that a bishop has the right to conduct a non-canonical investigation off his own bat, under his own authority, without any independent transparency or objectivity. He was evidently the only one who was participant in this investigation, and he took about a month to do it. You've got a whole month of basically silence from the bishop while the congregation is wounded and bruised and seeking desperately to have their senior leader show them guidance and strength. Of course, on the parish level at the ground, I pastored my flock. I tried to bandage up the wounds, but I too was hurting and looking for guidance from my bishop. And sadly, we received none. In fact, what we received was a slap in the face instead of the warm embrace of the right hand of fellowship. After this so-called investigation, no details about the process used to investigate were ever divulged. It turns out that the only people who suffered from this was the Emmanuel congregation and me. John determined a punitive measure towards myself and Emmanuel, which I and those who have looked at it, including people who have legal training, believe constitutes a disciplinary measure. And the basic outline of it was, without going into lengthy and excessive detail, Emmanuel and myself were banned from having any further student ministers or from having any ministerial colleagues work alongside us. This was especially painful to us because we had already lined up an ACNA presbyter, or priest in your tradition perhaps, who was going to come and be the assistant pastor with me at Emmanuel. We were just waiting for Bishop John's rubber stamp of approval on it. And he had his funding all lined up. We didn't even have to pay a penny. He was a missionary priest who had significant donors to support him. And we'd even been in communication with his bishop in the ACNA. That was all scuttled, shot down, and the amazing growth that would have brought to Emmanuel, unlocking the next stage of our desire to be a church-planting church reaching the northwest for Christ, was hampered by our own bishop, who sided with the student minister because he evidently holds the same Eastern Orthodox theology as him. So you can imagine how much this absolutely damaged and hurt the people at Emmanuel, and myself too. I have pretty thick skin, but I was fairly shocked. You would think if you turn to your bishop, you would expect him to uphold the doctrines of his own church instead of upholding the doctrines of some other denomination. I wrote to Bishop John, pointing out extensively actually the errors in his investigation report, factual inconsistencies, misinformation. I pointed out where he completely ignored consulting the congregation, many of whom had written witness statements. And it's of note here, and we have record of this, we have documentary evidence of this, there was also a safeguarding issue in the mix of all of this, which John never even bothered to address. He's never even dealt with it to this very day. This, I think, was most painful of all to the Emmanuel congregation, that we should be punished simply for holding to the doctrines of our own denomination. And that's when I think me and many people at our church started to realize there's something exceptionally wrong with Bishop John Fenwick's leadership and the Free Church of England's upper hierarchy in general. He, by and by, he never even bothered to respond to my email. Right now, to this very time, we have never had a response to that, and I have heard from other people, again, the pattern continues, other clergy who have been forced out or who have left and who have reported that they have felt harassed and bullied, etc., that they too simply had emails that never get answered. So it seems to me if you ask Bishop John a question that he doesn't like, he just never gives you the dignity of a response. Well, this is when things really got sour after that point between me and Bishop John and the Emmanuel congregation and John. There was nothing on our side in terms of animosity. We sought reconciliation over and over again, but we had absolutely no success in gaining it. It was always going to be a meeting on John's terms. And that is something else, yet again, that other presbyters who have left have said. He will only come to the table to talk about reconciliation if he puts umpteen caveats on coming to discuss the issues. This, I think, is where marked the beginning of the end, because when you fall into John Fenwick's crosshairs, you don't escape until he eliminates you. With the student minister situation still hanging unresolved over the Emmanuel congregation, and with continued attempts unfolding week by week, trying to get Bishop Fenwick to come to the table for reconciliation with the people who were really hurt and struggling over that issue, we had another incident unfold, which I think is congruent of the pattern I've mentioned previously, where Bishop Fenwick seems to compound issues in his ministry, never actually admitting he was wrong or dealing with the issues that he's created, sort of fumbling from one major controversy to the next, and they all sort of snowball together. This one was particularly controversial and caused a great deal of pastoral pain and hurt to the Emmanuel congregation, but it also had ramifications all around the world because of our large presence online through the streaming of our worship services, where we get sometimes up to 1,000 views of folks watching our services around the planet. This incident happened on Palm Sunday of 2024. John was scheduled to come and preach, as he would often do. He would announce at relatively short notice his desire to come to Emmanuel and to take the service and to say a sermon. Now, that's not unusual for a bishop, but he seemed to have an excessive focus on our church for doing that, because he and his wife Liz have openly admitted they have a sense of ownership of Emmanuel as their little church. So we would often have him pop in even unannounced for visits. But this particular one he had pre-planned just a little bit in advance, and he preached a sermon that caused an incredible amount of offense to people in our church family. The vast majority of people at Emmanuel Morecambe are moderately pro-Israel. Now, that's not something I've taught or I've gone into great detail with people on. It's just the way the Lord has drawn together a body of believers. And it's quite amazing when you think about it, because we are a Brady Bunch. Although I mentioned earlier we have gained an Anglican identity now, many of us come from vastly different theological traditions within the church. We've got former Baptists, former Pentecostals, former Roman Catholics, ex-Methodists, all of whom have fled out of either churches which have had dud pastors who are abusive, or they have fled denominations that have become apostate. And one of the things that is most incredible is that out of all of these different backgrounds and stories of people who have come to faith in Jesus Christ, at Emmanuel Church, almost all of them stand with the nation of Israel. They stand with the Jewish people as the first covenant people of God. Now, it's not absolutely everyone. There are people who have variances in their opinion on this, and we all agree to disagree because it is ultimately a secondary issue. But the general consensus is that Emmanuel is a pro-Israel church. And John Fenwick was very well aware of this. He had been informed of this by me. It was present in my monthly reports I was required to write to him and Dr. Bob. And I even mentioned that we had Messianic believers worshipping with us, and we're very blessed to have them. Bishop Fenwick came to preach on Palm Sunday, where you would expect a sermon about the triumphal entry of Christ into Jerusalem, or perhaps a foreshadowing of the Good Friday service, which was to come in the week ahead, and talk about the Passion, if you focus on the Passion narrative reading for Palm Sunday. But no, what we ended up with was what many believe to be a politicized sermon that pushed John's particular perspective on the Israel-Gaza war, rather than an exegetical sermon based on the scripture. I will play a short clip of this sermon now, that the section that caused the most upset. It's been widely distributed on Twitter X, and the link will be in the description to this video if you would like to watch the original yourself, but I will just pop it up here for you to see now.
There's an image that was on the news a few months ago that haunts me still. It was of a Palestinian boy in Gaza, covered in blood and dust. His family had been killed in a bombing by the Israeli state. And he cried out again and again, We didn't do anything. We didn't do anything. It's one of the most gut-wrenching images of undeserved suffering I think I've ever seen. He just couldn't understand why this had happened to him and his family when they had done nothing to provoke it. Jesus, too, was an innocent victim of the Israeli state.
Many people who heard that sermon in person and those online felt immediately that it had an anti-Semitic edge. Members of our congregation and people internationally, because of our large live streaming congregation, were extremely aggravated by this. The reaction, in fact, on the YouTube live stream, there's a live chat that happens during the worship service, and then there are comments which appear on the video once it's processed and saved, were almost entirely negative. People were enraged. In fact, just about the only positive comments on that video were by Liz Fenwick herself, the bishop's wife, who flew into a rage defending her husband, even stooping to personal insults of people who took issue with his words. People were deeply offended that a Christian bishop would openly claim that Jesus was killed by the Jews, which is, without the proper historical context, easily misconstrued, or some have argued it was his intention to actually paint the Jews in the worst possible light. It also seems his views about the Palestinians and his illustration of a little Palestinian boy suffering and being covered in blood and dust and in the rubble of Gaza, and the boy saying, "We've done nothing wrong, we've done nothing wrong," whilst completely ignoring the suffering of the Jewish people who were slaughtered by Hamas terrorists on October 7th, presented a very pro-Palestine political agenda for the bishop. And people, even if they weren't massively pro-Israel, what they saw was a distinct lack of balance, a distinct lack of nuance that you would think, if you were going to touch such a very, very sensitive topic, in the very least you would want to try and have a sense of balance to your sermon. So all of this resulted in 2 members of Emmanuel Morecambe and one of the online viewers internationally, a man from Canada, submitting formal complaints to the General Secretary. Yes, it's Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob's back. Yet again, as is the seemingly emerging pattern in the Free Church of England, the more you research it, the more you look into the history, the more you talk to people who have been burned by the FCE, the clearly outlined canonical process under Canon J for discipline of a clergyman and disciplining a bishop and dealing with complaints against a bishop was completely ignored. Now, unfortunately for us, we were not familiar enough with our own canons at the time to know that that was a problem. But we now, after I've been sacked and have looked into the canons extensively, know that that was actually clearly an agenda to get the bishop off the hook. If you don't use the canons, it can be contained. Very few people have to know about what's going on, and you can slap a confidentiality clause on any determination you make. Not that you have to listen to that under British law, but it certainly does intimidate people into being very quiet. And I am always instantly suspicious of anyone who wants to keep things in-house and under wraps. If you've got nothing to be ashamed of, then why do you want to keep everything secret? And this is exactly what happened in this situation. Dr. Stephen evidently just invented, out of thin air, a complaints review process to deal with this case. Interestingly, the way he tackled it was to appoint 2 independent reviewers to look at the complaints, to listen to the sermon or to read the transcript, and then to come up with a determination which he himself, as the General Secretary, would decide. Now, going back to earlier parts of my video, as I've said, he has no canonical authority to do that in the Free Church of England structures, none whatsoever. The role of the General Secretary is to do exactly what it says on the tin, to be a secretary, not to be a disciplinary judge, not to be a canonical adjudicator. His role is simply to answer emails, sign checks, and take minutes at meetings. That's it. That's the whole thing. It's an administrative task. But he is acting as, and I think he's being empowered to do so by both FCE bishops, as some sort of archdeacon or even a quasi-suffragan bishop. And he certainly does not have any qualms about wielding this imaginary power. So the case was sent off to these two independent, don't forget, reviewers. Interestingly enough, with a little bit of digging after we found out their names, one of them was known to Dr. Bob and is a fellow Church of England clergyman. Don't forget, Bob Stephen is not a member of the FCE. He is an employee and is still a Church of England priest who holds a permission to officiate in Leicester Diocese. I happen to think that that is a conflict of interest, and I think that that actually shows the potential. I'm not saying that this is what happened. I'm not making an accusation, but I'm saying there is the potential for bias there. And if you're investigating a formal complaint against the bishop primus of an entire denomination, the last thing you want is even the shadow of bias to be implied. Well, I think that the complainants speak for themselves. I have some excerpts here from their complaints. The first complainant said that, in their view, Bishop John's sermon amounted to a political speech. He hijacked the religious content of the sermon, that is, of Christ's suffering and persecution at the hands of the Pharisees and the Roman authorities, and he used it as a platform to promote his own views on the current Israeli-Palestinian war. The second complainant, they said that they did attempt to seek clarity and understanding directly from Bishop John, and he graciously responded. He did not, however, acknowledge any potential for partisan bias at a time of a complex conflict. He simply concluded, albeit politely, that I had ignorantly misheard what he said. And as an aside, from the many, many people I've spoken to now that I've been dismissed from the Free Church of England, and from my own experience, that is a very common tenet of Bishop John's handling of situations where he is criticised. He simply puts down the people who have criticisms of him or who raise issues with him. He looks down at them and sees them as lesser than him, and he dismisses them, sometimes, I believe, in a very patronising manner. That's my personal opinion. Right. You would think, with two hand-picked reviewers that you had selected to handle this case, that you might actually have a chance at getting the bishop completely off the hook and exonerated. But really, it turned out that it seems the content of this sermon was so off the mark that the reviewers actually couldn't, in good conscience, completely ignore it. So I'm going to read just a few highlighted sections from their response. Thirdly, I agree the sermon might have been expressed more wisely and with greater pastoral sensitivity. Now, that is, of course, in relation to the fact that the vast majority of people at Emmanuel are pro-Israel, and we have a couple of messianic believers in our midst. He goes on to say, in my view, a greater balance and sensitivity could have been shown. A sentence recognizing that the attack on Israel on October 7th also caused undeserved suffering might have drawn the sting out of the complaint. And that is what John said about the Palestinians. They had endured undeserved suffering, and his silence about the suffering of the Israelis obviously led many people to think that he was being pro-Palestine. The use of the term Israeli state perhaps gave the illustration an edge which might have skewed people's perception so that they considered there was a hint of anti-Semitism. To use the term of the time of Jesus is somewhat anachronistic, since they were then merely the Roman province of Judea. And that is correct. It is highly and historically inaccurate. You would think Dr. Fenwick, as a historian or a self-proclaimed historian, would actually know that there was no Israeli state in the 1st century AD. There was, in fact, simply the Roman province of Judea. And that's interesting to hear from that reviewer there, that he believed a greater balance was needed, and all it would have taken was just a couple of sentences added to the sermon to perhaps put a little oil on troubled waters. Then we have the second reviewer. Now, this reviewer was a little more pointed. Was the sermon political? In my view, yes, in that it spoke to current affairs over which there are different opinions. Regarding the Gazan boy, now this is the illustration John used of the little boy covered in blood and dust, whom he then later said was completely innocent, or the boy said he was completely innocent and didn't understand why these things had happened to him, without mentioning, remember, the suffering of the Jews. The description is powerful and challenging, and his situation is deeply tragic. Yes, I think everyone at Emmanuel agreed. However, to raise the conflict without any mention of the October 7th attack or hostages would seem unbalanced or a partial picture. That's absolutely correct. Regarding the parallel between the Israeli state, again, there's that anachronistic term, of Jesus' day and today, this is controversial. The historical situation and present-day situation, while having a geographical and ethnic overlap, are significantly different. The use of the same phrase draws a line between the crucifixion of Jesus and the suffering of Gaza and lays the blame for both on the Israeli state. In my view, that is overly simplistic and either unwise or at risk of creating anti-Jewish sentiment today. Even with those seemingly unfavourable independent reviews, Dr. Bob still dismissed the case. The people who had complained were not dealt with independently, but instead Bob wrote a joint email to all of them, and for some strange reason CC'd me into it, even though I wasn't aware that the complaints were even happening, as though I somehow have some sort of psychic level of insight into what my parishioners are getting up to. The reviewers were, I think, quite critical of Bishop John. This was not really addressed in the response that was delivered. It seems the Teflon bishop gets away with just about anything he likes because he has created a culture and an atmosphere of control and dominance that nobody can question. It doesn't say a great deal of good, does it, about a Christian leader who cannot be questioned if he is perceived to have made a mistake, who honest and open and transparent discussions about his theology and doctrine or his political perspectives cannot be asked by people in his denomination. And if they are asked, then a make-believe disciplinary process or complaints resolution process is invented to deal with it. Now, the cynic in me would say that this process was invented for a reason, for a purpose, to get rid of the complaint as quietly and quickly as possible. And in fact, Dr. Bob seems to confirm that in his determination. I'll read you a quote. It is conceded that the Bishop Primus could have been more balanced in his use of illustrations for his sermon. That's putting it lightly. However, if I were to agree that the sermon was deliberately political, I would also have to consider that the complaints were politically motivated. Well, I might be a simple-minded Australian who is with an outspoken nature, but I'll tell you what, where I come from, we have a word for that. It's a cop-out. Another issue of significant concern in the Free Church of England, particularly in the Northern Diocese, is that bishops have a statutory retirement age of 75. John Fenwick is now 73, and he has no succession plans in place. Now, as an aside, this has been a massive issue in relation to a presbyter who was allegedly unfairly dismissed by Fenwick, called the Reverend Arthur Kay, who had been minister of his congregation for over 35 years. Reverend Kay was told that because he was over 70, he couldn't continue to be a presbyter in charge of a congregation. But Bishop John then went on to ordain and put in charge of the Isle of Man congregation a presbyter who was in his 80s. Now, that's no slight against him. He is an exceptionally godly man, and I've had the privilege of getting to know him a bit, and his congregation are some of the most godly, beautiful Christians I've ever met. So it's nothing to say about their Christian character, but it does point to a deep hypocrisy in John Fenwick, who himself is now approaching retirement. He's well over 70. He's only got about 18 months left to go, and he's showing no signs of figuring out who will replace him. And this is a significant problem because the Northern Diocese seems to cycle through clergy on about a 5-yearly basis. New and dynamic, faithful, orthodox, mission-focused young men are recruited into the FCE. They are bright, shining stars of revival and renewal. They come in, they start to grow churches, they are successful in the ministry, and they are either forced out or quit under a storm of controversy and deep issues with the bishop. And this happens over and over again. And that means nobody hangs around long enough to be established to be the replacement bishop. And that is an exceptionally dangerous position for any denomination and diocese to be in. Bishop John just can't seem to keep clergy any longer than a few years. And anyone who seems to become a tall poppy is quickly chopped down. Now, according to his wife, Liz Fenwick, who was commenting on one of Emmanuel Church's live streams of worship, she decided to accost one of our parishioners on there and say some rather disparaging things about her. Why? Well, actually, out of the goodness of her own heart, a very gentle and beautiful Christian lady decided to pray at our intercessions for Bishop John to gracefully prepare to retire. She wasn't being malicious. She wasn't being undermining him in any way. She wasn't having a slight at him. She was simply concerned that as an elderly gentleman who had served for a long time in his diocese, he really needed to have a plan for someone to take the reins. And so that's what she prayed for, a peaceful, joyful, calm transition to someone whom God had called and anointed. But Mrs. Fenwick saw this as an insult against her husband, and I think in a bit of a Freudian slip revealed, possibly, that there is no succession plan whatsoever, because she said, well, I won't repeat what she said here, but the gist of what her messages were was simply that John has no plans to retire anytime soon. This ensued a number of people jumping on that comment, particularly taking issue with how rude she was, and she does have a reputation of being quite vicious. Whether or not that's true, I couldn't say, but people in the past have said that she has been most unpleasant with them, particularly in written communication. And this comment chain continued on for a number of weeks, in fact, after the video was posted live on the YouTube, with basically a bun fight breaking out where people were saying it's time for John to go. And it seems a lot of people around the world share that opinion. And a lot of people have been in some way impacted, usually it seems to me quite negatively, by Bishop Fenwick. And they think that now the only hope for the Free Church of England is to have some fresh blood in the leadership, some new, dynamic, younger, someone with a vision for growth and mission. Well, some people in the FCE thought that would be me. And I was approached by a number of my brother clergy with the suggestion that I could be the next Bishop of the North after John's retirement. Now, initially, I agreed. I jumped at the idea. I thought that would be the best step for the church. I felt that I was best equipped to do it, particularly with my public profile, to raise the FCE's awareness in the general populace. But after a lot of prayer and self-reflection and the Holy Spirit piercing my heart, I actually stepped back from that role and that suggestion because I realized my ego was too pridefully tied up in the idea of episcopal power. I am a parish minister. That's my role and my job, and I didn't want to take away from that either. It's a very busy and demanding role to plant a church, and especially a growing and dynamic church like Emmanuel. Also, not going to lie, my wife was not particularly impressed with the idea that I would be bishop on top of running a parish and having a baby on the way, and having 2 sons to raise and all the other things I have to do. And frankly, I don't usually do my chores at home and get my dishwasher loaded on time at the best of times. So if I had a purple shirt and I was traveling around the world doing all those bishopy things, yeah, she'd have no chance of getting the dishes done. So she was not impressed. So that was also another reason why I stepped away. So I actually started to promote and lift up another presbyter who I felt would be, at the time, would be good for the role. Although my opinion on that has actually changed dramatically in recent weeks. It was a bit of a secret. We didn't want to arouse John's anger. We also didn't want him to feel threatened. We were starting to, in the diocese, get to know the kind of way he would treat people if he saw them as a competitor to his authority and power. And I think I was already inadvertently in that position. He had the hard authority, as a brother in the States put it, a fellow presbyter in the States put it. He had the hard power and authority, but I had a lot of soft influence and authority. And people generally very much liked me and wanted me around. And so I think even if I didn't want it, I was already in that position of being perceived as a threat. That's just my personal opinion. But I think that John is a man who cannot handle the idea of letting go of his power. He has become the Bishop Primus, and in a recent video on the internet by Donald Veach, featuring Trevor and Ann Jordan, who were former members for 14 years at Emmanuel Church Morecambe and have had many, many difficult dealings, allegedly, with Bishop John, they claim that there was even a great deal of controversy about him getting to be Primus, and a lot of politicking that they claim went on. So if you were going to climb to the top, you certainly don't want to let go of it once you're there. And it's a tragedy because I would, if I was in his shoes, I would want to just ride off into the sunset, get a pat on the back, job well done, and go spend time with my family before my time runs out. I'm very conscious as a man who's had 3 very close calls with death in my life that actually nothing can be taken for granted, and you've got to put the first things first. The order that we're supposed to serve as ministers is God, family, church. And that's always something that's very prominent in my mind. But anyway, I think that somebody leaked to John that some of the other clergy wanted me to be the next Northern Diocesan Bishop, or at least that people thought it was a good idea. And that seems to be the assumption that he's probably gone with. That he's thought that that's what I was aiming for, not knowing, actually, that months and months ago I had abandoned the idea altogether for the sake of my congregation and my family. With all of that in view, including the stuff we've talked about in previous segments on this video, I think it's actually pretty clear that Emmanuel Church, because of their godliness and faithfulness, their desire for transparency, and also that they wanted their bishop to uphold the denominational doctrines of his own church, and my perceived popularity and possibility of being a threat to his leadership, I think that led to, actually, on the 11th of July in 2024, me receiving a notification of a disciplinary action against me. Now, I'm going to go into the nitty-gritty details of that disciplinary in future videos, but I will say here at the end of this one that the things that I was accused of were absolutely and unequivocally disproved by my legal team with over 100 pages of documentary evidence. Not only were they disproved, but the whole thing had more holes in it than Swiss cheese. And in fact, some of my evidence actually directly contradicted the claims made, which means that the accusations were either lies or the people making them had terrible memories. For instance, there were even emails I had which basically totally disproved some of the claims made against me. Emails from the people making the accusations. So either they forgot, or they didn't read their own emails, or there was an agenda afoot to just get rid of me. And I think actually it's the latter. So we will return in another video, beloved, and we will explore exactly what accusations were made against me, which I know a lot of people have been waiting to hear. They've been very curious, and I will go through them all, showing you point for point, blow for blow, exactly how flawed they were, and actually, most of them, how incredibly petty and frankly immature a lot of them were, simply as a scattershot attack to overwhelm me and to have an excuse for dismissing me while making it look like a legitimate disciplinary process occurred. So I shall see you all in part 2.